Welcome to the Forest Wild. I'm Charlie, and this podcast exists because I've become fascinated with a question. And that question is, what if there's something living alongside us on this planet that we've collectively decided not to see? Not because it's hiding in some other dimension, and not because it's mythological, but because acknowledging it would require us to admit that our understanding of reality may be incomplete. I know what you're thinking. Great, another Bigfoot podcast. But here's the thing, I'm not interested in proving anything. That conversation has been happening for decades, and frankly, it's, to me, exhausting. What I am interested in is this. What becomes possible when you stop asking, is this real? And start asking, if this is real, what does that mean? Because once you start looking at the patterns, really looking, you'll realize we're not just talking about some undiscovered ape wandering around the PNW. We're talking about something that operates according to principles that we don't have frameworks for. Something that seems to understand human behavior better than we do. Something that can stay invisible to our most advanced technology, not through luck, but through what can only be described as intelligence. Now, why does this matter? Because if consciousness can operate in ways we haven't figured out yet, if intelligence can manifest in forms we haven't yet cataloged, then everything we think we know about what's possible on this planet might need an update. This is a show about consciousness. It's a show about intelligence. It's about the possibility that we are sharing this earth with teachers we've been too proud to recognize. And about what happens when you stop hunting for proof and you start listening for frequency. So if you're ready to explore some ideas that don't yet fit in peer-reviewed journals, and if you're curious about consciousness that operates outside of our current paradigms, if you're willing to consider that mystery might be a little more interesting than answers, this is where we begin. Let's see what's out there when we stop demanding that it prove itself to us. Welcome to the Forest Wild. I'm your host, Charlie. Let me ask you something. Which is more likely? That 6,000 people, cops, park rangers, combat veterans, biologists, regular folks with nothing to gain across every U.S. state and most of Canada over 75 years are all hallucinating the exact same 6 to 12 foot tall bipedal hair-covered figure that smells like death, that throws rocks, that makes wood knocks, and watches them from the tree lines. Or something's actually out there. Not a monster, not a myth, but something real that we've collectively decided can't exist because it doesn't show up for our cameras. Here's the thing. I'm a former police officer. I started looking into this phenomenon thinking that I would be able to investigate it and debunk it. Like, write it off. I'd move on, having figured out the secret. Hey, it's this monkey costume that all these hoaxers have bought from Amazon. But I started looking at the actual numbers and the patterns and listening to personal anecdotes on different podcasts, and something stopped adding up after a little while. So the BFRO, the Bigfoot Field Research Organization, has documented over 5,000 Class A encounters. That's like where a person sees a being with their own two eyes. There's Class A, Class B is like you see evidence like a footprint or something. And then there's Class C and stuff, I think. So with that many encounters, those aren't just like, hey, I heard something weird in the woods. Those are Class A encounters. That's 5,000 times where somebody reported, I saw it, it looked at me, it was not a bear. 5,000 times. And those are the ones that people actually took the time to go and report to the Bigfoot Field Research Organization. Now, research on anomalous experiences shows that about 1 in 10 to 1 in 20 people report what they've seen. Apply that math, and we're not talking about 6,000 encounters. We're talking 60 to 120,000. So either we've got the most elegant hoax in human history, spanning generations, spanning cultures, and spanning technologies, or we need to reconsider what we think is possible. Today, we're going to explore a little different way of looking at this. It's not do they exist, but it's What if consciousness operates differently than we all assume it does? Because here's what 70 years of hunting with technology has produced us. Nothing. Zero definitive proof, despite military-grade thermal imaging, motion sensors, surveillance systems that can spot a mouse at 300 yards. Nothing. The Olympic Project, the most methodical scientific approach that was ever attempted. There were years of systematic coverage, miles and miles of trail cams having covered an area, and their success rate was 0. Meanwhile, random people with no equipment, no intention, no preparation, they have experiences that shatter their worldview while they're sitting by a campfire eating a hot dog over a fire. That's not coincidence. That is a pattern telling us something important. Let me tell you about the Bluff Creek Project. 2011 to 2014, researchers identified travel routes based on 30 years of footprint data. The same paths were used repeatedly. They set up dozens of trail cams exactly where this evidence said to put them. And those footprints stopped immediately. Not gradually tapered off, they stopped. 3 years of cameras in locations with decades of consistent track evidence, and then nothing. 6 months after they were removed, the footprints started appearing again in the same exact locations. And you can't explain that with conventional thinking. Unless these things know where the cameras will be placed before they're placed. Unless they're operating from a different relationship with time than we are. It just can't be explained. Witnesses describe this consistently. It's the feeling of being expected almost, rather than surprising something in the woods. It's like the encounter was somehow orchestrated. Like whatever they saw knew that they'd be there before they did. Dr. Tom Powell mapped encounters from 2010 to 2020. He found synchronized activity patterns, the same day sightings, thousands of miles apart, occurring within minutes of each other. And that's not migration, it's a coordinated response across impossible distances. We're not dealing with animals. We're dealing with something that operates through consciousness networks that we don't understand. Think about it this way. These beings can apparently read human intention before humans are aware of it. And days before you consciously decide to look for them, your patterns shift. They detect this. When you decide to search for something, either on Instagram or Google, every emotion attached broadcasts a frequency. Dr. David Hawkins mapped this out for 30 years. Fear vibrates around 100 hertz, acceptance vibrates around 350 hertz, and genuine presence, authenticity, is about 500 and above. By the time that you're packing cameras and you're driving to the location, the beings in the forest have had weeks to coordinate a response. And here's the kicker, they're not just avoiding you, they're deciding if you're ready for contact. And those equipment failures follow very specific patterns. They're not random. The batteries are drained in sequence. It's the GPS first, and then the cameras, and then the flashlights. And digital data corruption usually affects only the subject, but not the background somehow. Audio records everything except the actual encounter sometimes. Statistical probability of this being a coincidence is less than winning the lottery 5 times in a row. Every serious witness says the same thing after an encounter. They don't say, "I saw an ape." They say that reality seemed to break, that time felt weird. I felt like I was underwater, and the woods were silent. This is not a biological anomaly. It is somehow consciousness operating outside of our frameworks of understanding. Indigenous people have known this forever. The Lumi Nation calls them Semekwis. The Lakota knew them as the Shiatanka. They're different names, but the same observations. They're beings who know what will happen somehow. They can become invisible. They can communicate mind to mind. These aren't myths, and they are consistent observations across cultures that have no contact with each other. So here's what I think we're looking at. One or the other. Either tens of thousands of people are wrong in the exact same way, hallucinating identical features, behaviors, sounds, smells, Or our scientific method, designed to study the repeatable and visible, simply hasn't caught up to phenomena that don't want to be repeatable or visible. David Fravor's Navy testimony about UAPs got Pentagon validation, but when forest rangers report encounters themselves, it's somehow career suicide. Their testimony would convict someone of murder in court, but for this phenomenon, suddenly trained observers can't tell bears from 8-foot bipedal figures. What if we're not finding them because we're assuming they want to be found? What if they're not hiding in forests, but in the folds of our conscious perception? What if they're sentient enough to know our rules and choose to break them? Science doesn't just ask what exists, it decides what's allowed to exist. And when something doesn't show up for peer review, doesn't leave dead bodies, doesn't care about our cameras, science doesn't say, we don't know. Science says, no, you're crazy. For this podcast, I interviewed people, not conspiracy theorists, a retired sheriff in Oregon, a middle school principal in West Virginia, a biologist who wouldn't use their name because it would ruin their funding. They don't want to convince you. Most are uncomfortable even talking about it. Their hands shake, their voices tighten. One man kept looking at the trees behind me like something might still be there. These people aren't lying. And if they're not lying, we're not dealing with misidentification. We're brushing against something that we're not supposed to understand, at least not yet. Somebody who believes that all of these witnesses are lying, they're not a skeptic. They actually have faith. They have faith that the world is exactly as small and predictable as they were told. They have faith that the silence in the woods means that nobody's and nothing's watching. The evidence suggests that consciousness operates by different rules than matter. And these beings demonstrate abilities that we've forgotten we have. Every failed expedition teaches the futility of force. Every equipment malfunction shows the consciousness protecting itself from being reduced to data. They're not hiding from us. They're waiting for us to develop the consciousness necessary to meet them where they exist, in dimensions beyond current perception, and in frequencies we haven't accessed, in awareness states that our culture doesn't recognize. This podcast is not about finding Bigfoot. This podcast is about remembering what consciousness can do when it's not trapped in materialist paradigms. If you are ready to stop hunting and start really listening, this is where we begin together. The next episode will explore how these beings might navigate time itself, seeing your future before you've lived it. I'm Charlie, and this is The Forest Wild, and it doesn't need you to believe in it to exist.